Thank you, everyone who stuck around. This actually promises, I think, to be the most interesting talk of the day, but I'm a little biased because I kind of like RDM. Anneliese Eber is the RDM librarian at the University of Waterloo and co-investigator, co-applicant, co-whatever on this connection grant. So she has long been planning to do this talk. And she has brought today Alyssa, the co-op student in research data management that she is working with, who's going to give a little bit of a talk on fair data as part of the presentation. And I won't bore you all with anything else, but take it away, Anneliese.
Awesome, thank you. I think this is on, but for folks online, if at any point you can't hear me or if I put the mic down, please flag it because I'm not used to holding a mic when I can't hear if it's on or not. Like Grant mentioned, I'm Anneliese Eber from the University of Waterloo, and this is my co-op student, Alyssa Roussy, who's here co-presenting with me. And thank you for those of us, or those of you who stuck around online and in person, who will battle the rush hour traffic with me after. I'm excited to be here talking with you all, and excited to bring kind of maybe a different perspective to talking about restricted data than we've heard before, as well as some kind of practical, what do we actually do with this? We've heard a lot about what are the issues with restricted data, how does this impact us, but where do we go from here? We know that all of these problems exist, and we know the things we need to solve. We've identified some people who are the people who might solve them in some of the issues, but where do we actually go from here? And why am I the one talking to you? I'm from the library. What am I doing with data? So research data management librarian, but I also have a background in research, specifically in anthropology and archaeology with rats, and my specialty is human evolution. So it's kind of an interesting area to do data management with, where you have things that you have all like the ethical implications as you often would with living human ethics, but they are not living anymore. And my specific research interests these days are really in addressing data management issues, barriers, challenges in biological anthropology and kind of these fields where we see these unique data management issues that people just kind of shove under the carpet. We don't want to talk about them. They're too complex to deal with, so we just choose to ignore them. Governments aren't talking about them. We don't have conferences talking about them, and that's kind of where my research interests lay these days. So I've battled many of these kind of data management challenges, both professionally and in my research background, and to this day. So I promise I'm not just talking about something I don't know about here. Kind of just an overview of today, thinking that this might be a little bit shorter than originally intended because there's not as many people of you and people here, and I did plan time for kind of discussion throughout in any questions. So people still might be able to get out of here a little bit before rush hour. So when we think about data sharing and data management, what's the point? Why are we even concerned with this? And people have talked about this throughout, and I know in the previous panel someone mentioned that a lot of the same topics are coming up again and again, so skipping over them. I'm going to talk about them again because I think those recurring themes are the ones that are really important for us to think about, and the more we talk about them, the more we think about them, and the more we hear them come up, it kind of resonates with, this is what's important, this is what we should be thinking about. And then rethinking restricted data. What is it? We've talked about human stuff. We've talked about education, labor, health data. What is restricted data? What falls into those categories? And how does it become restricted? And then looking at a little bit of a case study while I talk about some restricted fossil data, which is always a pleasure to talk about and something that people don't often think about. And Grant has given me permission to talk about because I can tie it all in really nicely with the restricted data here. And then kind of working with restricted data. How do we actually on the ground do this work, and hopefully maybe have a conversation with some of the folks online and the few you left here of what does this look like? And then where do we go from here? And is this really just a policy thing, or is this a whole cultural shift that we need to see? And this has come up a number of times already about Canada has a very different mentality about data than other places do. And we're seeing this really shift in real time in 2025 as well, like that mentality around data sharing, around restricting our data use as big tech uses our data for who knows what, and so on and so forth. And then we have a picture here of some restricted data that is my own data. It's restricted, it's not available, I can't make it available. It's virtually meaningless. And I think this really embodies a lot of the restricted data you're able to get online. This is just a picture of a whole whack of dots, and that's exactly what it looks like to anyone. And I can make this available, but the data behind it, I can't make available. And in this format, it's meaningless. It's not reusable. It's not useful to anyone else but me, let alone even anyone else on my own research team. So what's the point here? And we think about research data management as really embodying responsible research. So integrity, reproducibility, replicability, transparency, credibility, and accountability. And these are all things as researchers, be it early career or well into your career, that you want to say applies to your own research. My research is credible, it's transparent, it's replicable. And the goal, and this is kind of like the gold standard of research and data management, is to make this research reproducible and replicable, because without it being reproducible and replicable, you're just saying, trust me, I know what I did, this is true, you're just gonna have to trust me on that. And we've seen many cases, especially recently, where we've maybe trusted people and maybe that's not true, or you're asked to put blind faith into whatever wild claim is put out there, and that's just that. So the goal of research and ultimate goal of research data management is to create research that is transparent and create that transparent background of all of the research you've done in the past. But what happens when we don't share data? So this is a really busy slide of just a couple headings that I've pulled. Many of them are from Nature. They're really big headings. We see paper retractions, people losing their jobs, untrustworthy clinical trials. You probably don't want untrustworthy clinical trials. That's health data. Studies being faked, flawed, more paper retractions, papers at risk of disappearing from the internet, fraud. I'm not sure about anyone else's research, but when I hear these types of words, I don't think, yes, this is what we want our research to look like. We really want our papers to be retracted. We want to see huge numbers of papers being retracted over a short period of time. And this isn't to say that all paper retractions are going to be bad. There are very valid reasons why something might be retracted and why it should be retracted. And this is also a process of responsible and transparent research. But when we see this many things being retracted, and when you go in to see why, it's often they faked the data, or there was data manipulation, image manipulation. The data is not available to check, so the editors are no longer confident in the results. You see words like disgraced. I don't think anyone wants to be that disgraced researcher that ends up in headlines all over the place. I have just used this example, but there are many examples out there. They're really not hard to find. But what are these kind of like big picture problems? So you see all those headlines from journal articles, newspaper articles. You can find them really anywhere. But what are like the big themes there that we see? So we see it leads to questionable credibility. You start seeing all of these papers retracted, and people, not always researchers, but especially the public, starts to think, well, if all of these are being retracted and this was wrong, why should I trust that this other thing is now right? And that's where we see this issue of credibility really come up, because some of these big retractions, especially the big flashy ones, often dealing with health data, make it to the news, and that can be misconstrued in any number of ways. You don't often see kind of ecology researchers researching very niche things like my rat teeth would never come up in the news like that because it's not a life or death situation. But other topics that you can think of in modern eras probably do come up in the public and in the public discourse. And you start to have conversations about, well, how do I know this is true? Because we have all of these papers, and this landmark paper, which is still being cited, has been retracted, but we're saying it's fraudulent and false now. So which is it? And without that kind of background in research to understand those processes, it's hard to build that credibility and understand and kind of parse through all of that extra discourse online or in different communities. So it's really on researchers to put out responsible research so that we are being responsible to the people we're putting out research to. And then a note of all of those estimations of replicability are suboptimal. There is no good number of research reproducibility out there. We can try and estimate this all we want. If it's not 100% or near there, it's not ideal. I didn't include the numbers here, but they're not great. And it's also hard to guesstimate that number or estimate that number because reproducing research is really difficult. So it wastes a lot of time trying to reproduce research to get this number only to end up with this isn't reproducible and I've just wasted a colossal amount of time trying to do so. And one of the big ones that we see probably really prevalent right now is the negative impact on health outcomes in public health. And we've seen this kind of throughout today, talking about health data, talking about education, even labor data. How does that impact our own health outcomes? We're basing our research and we're basing things on data that's 5 years old. Our census data, we don't even know where people are from 5 years ago. And the world has wildly changed since 2021. And I cannot overstate that enough. We are basing things on values that we had in a fundamentally different world than what we are living in today. And ultimately, it erodes trust in science and research. And that, I think, is a problem because as we move forward, and the way forward is building trust in research. And researchers are doing fantastic work out in the world. So if we're doing this research and the public doesn't trust us, who are we responsible to as researchers or as people in the academy? If we're being responsible putting our data out there, that's great. But if we're putting bad data out there, who are we responsible? And building trust once it's eroded is much harder than it is to preserve it. Oops. And when we look at what does it mean to even be responsible research? Ideally, we're not making the proof. If you're making the proof as you go, is that really reproducible? Maybe, but probably not. If you're kind of just making things up as you go, producing data that backs your claim, is this reproducible? Maybe. Is it credible or accountable? Not really. So ideally, for something to be responsible and transparent, it must be data-driven, not belief-driven. It has to be evidence-based. So you should ideally be able, with the data, be able to say, this is the data that backs up what I am saying here. And it should be transparent. So documentation is a big one. Being able to say, this is exactly what I did with the data. This is where it lives. This is everyone who had access to it. This is how I manipulated it, cleaned it, what have you. You've been really open and transparent about that process. And if people can see that you've been transparent, maybe there are mistakes, but you've still been transparent about that process and open to perhaps criticism or other changes. People can point out, say, hey, maybe we would do this a different way, or did you consider this? And that transparent process is really invaluable to creating responsible research and is a big part of the RDM process as we think of how do we actually get to this transparent research. And it's a spectrum of transparency here. And RDM is a big way you do that by kind of managing your project and your work throughout the life cycle. Also, creating documentation as you go is a huge one, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But also remembering that correlation does not equal causation is a big part of responsible research and something a lot of people forget. And then data does not go to, I should have put another divider in there, but data goes to claims and not the other way. You don't make a claim and then build the data off of it, which is kind of like a backwards way to do science. It's certainly not the way I would choose to do science, but I guess it is a way to do it. And thinking about responsible research, what do you actually want to do? Not what are we kind of seeing from certain places today. It upholds ethical standards, whatever those may be, and they're not made up things. They are there for a reason. It minimizes potential harms to any number of things. And when we think about harms, we think about the societal harms, environmental harms, and community harms. And we've talked about that a lot today, or heard a lot from folks today, as we think about health data. Who is the data about and who is it for? Or labor data. How can we minimize harms for society if we're not basing our research off of modern data? How do we do these types of things and minimize harm as much as possible? Again, transparent and reproducible research. Without these two things, these are kind of core tenets of research, and we need them to make our research have positive impacts. Policy compliance is a big one. This is kind of one that changes depending on who your funder is, who the government is, various privacy laws. So when I say policy compliance, this is where a lot of people struggle to navigate and where research may become restricted because navigating competing policies can be really difficult. And then practicing responsible data collection, analysis, storage, and sharing wherever possible, recognizing that sharing not always possible, but just because we can't share data doesn't mean that there aren't research data management things that we can do throughout the rest of the process. A lot of people will often conflate research data management as being data sharing. They're the same thing, and sharing can be part of the research data management process, but research data management is not entirely data sharing. But how do we get here? There's a lot of issues in research right now, and we see a lot of kind of public distrust in science, and we're living through the real world implications of that distrust that has been building for decades, but has really been exacerbated in the last couple of years. It's kind of a multifaceted problem. There is no single reason. So there are questionable research practices like data manipulation, excluding outliers, not reporting unsatisfactory results. I don't like this, so I'm just not going to publish a paper about it. So you really see this publication bias because you don't want to report negative results or unsatisfactory. How do you get funding if you spend thousands of dollars doing a research project and only to find out this isn't what I was looking for, so I'm not going to publish it. I'm going to publish this other really small, flashy thing that might be true because you have to get funding. How do we do research without funding? Lack of access to methodological information and research data. A very common thing is it's all in the paper. And even when I get data deposited to our instance of Borealis, when we put in our README asking for methodological information, people will also fill out see paper. Paper may not be published. Paper may not have adequate information, and I'll send it back and say, can you please put some of it here, or can you please link the paper here, and really trying to tie those things together, because again, paper without data without methodological information is about as useful as my collection of dots on one of the first slides. Not that useful. How did I make those dots? What are those dots? Where did they come from? Mismanagement of data sets is a big one, and this is not to say this is always intentional mismanagement of data. There is also very unintentional mismanagement of maybe you mislabeled something. Maybe it's just not knowing what something is. And these are accidental things. They're not malicious. They're not something someone set out to do on purpose. But by practicing RDM and putting some of these practices in place, we can try to mitigate some of these things so that we don't have, oops, I submitted the wrong data with my paper, and then having another version where it says we've uploaded new data to this, or saying 10 years down the road, we don't know where the data is. I know we were supposed to keep it, but I don't know where it is, so I can't prove that this is what I did because my data's gone. And cognitive bias is a big one, and that's kind of a whole other can of worms. But you can see on the right, this is kind of from the classic reproducibility crisis paper of people trying to reproduce their own research, not just other people's research, their own research, which in theory, you should be able to do. You should be able to look at your research and the documentation you may have or should have created for yourself and reproduce your own results or replicate them to some extent. But apparently, this is also an issue. And I think this speaks to a broader kind of culture issue of how are we doing RDM not only for others, but for ourselves as well. When we think of RDM, we think of it often kind of what is the good to everyone else out there, to the broader community, but really we need to RDM for ourselves before we can RDM for other people. And often in my own work, we'll joke about, oh, we need to RDM our own work. And sometimes we'll be looking for a file on a collaborative project and we can't find it. And we're like, man, we did a really bad job RDMing our own work. And I'm saying it jokingly, but when we see things like this, it's really important to do these things for yourself, even if knowing down the road, your data is going to be restricted. But then we get to kind of like the bigger structural issues that kind of cause in many ways those individual issues. So misaligned incentives in tenure and promotion. You need funding and you need big grants to get tenure. How it really incentivizes kind of maybe sometimes taking these shortcuts, because doing good research the responsible way takes a lot of time and money. It's much faster to publish something that's maybe not quite right, but would have taken you another few months to do better. Publishing or perishing, a well-known paradigm that we all exist in academia, especially as researchers, even to an extent as librarians. How do we exist in this time we find ourselves in? Publication metrics. Everyone is looking at H indexes or whatever other indexes they're looking at to prove, yes, I am doing good research, I'm a leader in my field. These are kind of made up metrics. Publishers develop their own metric based on whatever thoughts, feels, and vibes they wanted to. And now you have a bazillion different indices to indicate what is the impact of my work. And we're really looking at numerical impact here. And there was a good point that Beth made before when she's looking at knowledge mobilization and things she puts out there. It can be really hard. And maybe only one person looks at your data. But what is the value of that one person looking at that high quality data? And this isn't something that academia and kind of tenure and promotion looks into. It doesn't reward taking the time to put out that good data, which maybe for that one researcher has a huge impact. So it really prioritizes quantity over quality. And this is never something you want to see. Ideally, you are putting out quality research, and it does slow things down. It makes things a lot slower, and maybe you find an error halfway through and you're like, I should have done this way. Backtracking and redoing things takes a lot of time. Speaking of time, better reception of hypothesis supporting research. These are the flashy things that show up in journals. I thought that this caused this. Here's my heading that proves that this is true. You rarely see, I thought that X might cause Y, but I didn't find that to be the case, and here's a paper about why it didn't. It just doesn't look as good. It doesn't attract as much funding because it's not flashy. And this means that people are less likely to report negative results, or could be incentivized to remove an outlier that just confuses things, what have you. These types of kind of prioritizing and incentivizing, even if it's subtle, it's not like journals are out there saying, we only want flashy headers, but all of us know that this is the reality that we live in, whether we want to or not. You never see a Nature paper or a science paper that says, I thought that Tylenol causes autism. This is not true. So you might now, but previous to now, it's not a Nature paper. It doesn't look flashy. So journals resist publishing these null results. Again, not flashy, but this creates a publication bias where you're only publishing positive results. You're only publishing things that support hypotheses. You're not publishing the other side of things. So where is that data? The opposite side of the data is there, but it's not published. It's not available. It's probably not even restricted. It's probably just invisible. It doesn't exist. And again, kind of this publishers don't want to publish things that lack of contribution to whichever community, it's publishers who are deciding what contributes to the scientific community or to a research community, not the researchers themselves. So if a publisher deems it not substantial enough, now what do you do with that research? And this again also leads to that publication bias. But maybe as part of our research data management practices, there's other data that can be made available that people can find and investigate themselves. We don't need to just be publishing our data and putting out our data that supports papers. There's much more data that can be made available. And a lot of that is what we looked at today. There are these big data sets that aren't associated with a specific paper, but could still be made available so people can look at them, draw their own conclusions from them, and do all kinds of really fantastic research based on these bigger data sets. But again, those data sets are restricted, hard to access. Sometimes you don't even know they exist. And that's a really big problem, is the findability and discoverability of the data itself. So a couple challenges to sharing data here. There's data sovereignty and ownership. This we've talked about earlier today and heard a lot about, but this is also, when we think about data sovereignty and ownership, it's not just data sovereignty and ownership with First Peoples in Canada, but much broader than that as well. We think about First Peoples across the entire world, and this can also make things challenging. And there are We talked about the OCAP principles, but these are a best practice in a lot of places, specifically for First Nations here, but there isn't the same kind of structure with doing research in different areas of the world. Ethical considerations is a huge one. What consent for sharing data, whose REB is this going through? REBs have different approval processes that make things complicated. It's all very complicated. Legal obligations, again, all very complicated and difficult to navigate. And these difficulties in navigating data access, and data sharing make it really easier for researchers to say, I'm just going to call it restricted data or data available upon request, because navigating these things is really difficult. It takes a lot of time and it's frustrating, and you might never come to an answer. You might spend tons of time only to find out that it's been wasted. And then commercial reasons and obligations. And this is something we see a lot, especially at Waterloo, which is big on kind of entrepreneurship and commercialization, is there are third parties, there are NDAs. So this is also a consideration and not something that we kind of talked as much about today. But when we think about restricted data, so we've talked almost exclusively today about restricted data as it applies to people, but what is restricted? How do we define restricted data? So someone mentioned that they're Gen X and have a lot of clip art in their slides. I am millennial and have many memes in mine. But I think these really kind of embody what is restricted data? How do we define it? And I asked Grant a couple of weeks ago, how did you guys define restricted data? Looking through recent papers, and it said, well, we didn't try to define it. But then looking for a definition, what is restricted data? And hearing about people's different perspectives on what is restricted data. If we can't define it or don't understand what it is, how can we solve a problem? And I think what we've seen today is that there's a lot of different types of restricted data, and there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But evidently, there is also not a one-size-fits-all definition. And we're really defining the unknown here. Part of the issue with restricted data is that it's invisible to a lot of people. You don't know what's there. And this is something that's come up quite a bit at Waterloo recently with some projects I've worked on, is that they're trying to find the data that's restricted in the first place. So this is, I think, a big part of what Grant and Joanne talked about as you went across Canada, is the findability of data, and you don't even know what's there. Something that's not immediately accessible. Okay, great. Only available upon request. That's a little bit different. Health data and openly accessible information on how to obtain the data, but data are sensitive in some ways. And we often talk about sensitive and restricted data as two sides of the same coin, and they are the same thing. But in many ways, restricted data is a little bit more broad, I think, than sensitive data, because access is just not immediately available. And sometimes that access not being immediately available is because you don't know it's there. And then we end up repeating a lot of research and redoing the same things because the data isn't available. And someone else mentioned that earlier today as well. We're just repeating the same research, spending the same funds, asking people to do the same questionnaire after their visit because we're really bad at sharing data. And we don't know it exists. There's nothing for us to find or work with because it is where, if you're not getting data from the RDC or Stats can, where else do you get restricted data from? In a lot of cases, there's not that many places, and apparently other provinces are much better than Ontario is, but I've always lived in Ontario and worked in Ontario, so I only come with the Ontario background. So it's really great to hear that other provinces are doing much better at this than some of us sometimes, making an effort. And then we see different terms, and this also kind of makes the issue more confusing. What is restricted data or restricted use, restricted access? And people will often use words interchangeably, but what does this mean? So we have this terminology that we use, and this is an issue that I've talked a lot about in terms of RDM, being really conscious of the language we're using, because when we use mix and match words that may have different meanings in different contexts, it becomes much more difficult to navigate. So we think restricted use, maybe that's non-commercial use, but it might not be restricted data, it's just restricted use. Restricted access could mean one thing, could be restricted data, hard to tell. It depends on each platform, so there's no standard language as we as we work through different types of data. Maybe within health, they have a standard language for this, but I kind of doubt it. Maybe across educational research, Grant's shaking his head. There's no standard language for anything. And this is a really big issue that we have, is people are trying to navigate things that I don't think any of us really understand. And why are things restricted? There's a lot of reasons. We've touched on a number of these today. So confidentiality, varying privacy legislation. I learned recently that every province has its own privacy legislation, and it varies wildly. So when we talked about data doesn't really cross provincial or territorial borders, this makes sense. It also doesn't cross international borders, is another big one that I'll talk about in a second. But these privacy legislations make it really difficult to work with any data when you're trying to create kind of a bigger data set looking at cross-border, whichever border that is, data, and looking at different things. But how do you work with data if you don't understand another province's legislation? And let me tell you, looking at these different things, very difficult. And as someone who is not in policy or government policy, as a researcher, I don't know what these things mean half the time. So you have to consult other experts and then bring in other people to explain things. And it just kind of snowballs from there because we've used language that doesn't resonate with anyone. Material might be copyrighted, whatever that looks like. You're doing collaborative research, either interinstitutional, intercontinental. So for example, the research I work on involves people from Canada, the States, Indonesia, Europe, Australia. You're now looking at kind of 6 continents privacy legislation and another dozen schools, research data management requirements, their data sharing requirements. And this can make it really hard. And it's just easier to say, we can't share the data. It's available upon request. Or looking at a journal saying they require data deposit, I will publish my data somewhere else, because navigating these issues is really difficult. Embargoes on data, whatever that may be. Embargoes are a little bit different because often embargoes are lifted and then something might become open, but I digress. A big one is people have careers built on a data set. There's a single data set. They will do their entire career looking for different things in that data set, or various different things. Or in archaeology, they'll build their entire career on a single dig site, but they might hold a bunch of stuff from publication as they've built their career on it. They're rightfully hesitant to make it open because what if someone else comes in and does that? And where are they going? In archaeology, you can't just go out and find a new hole in the ground that has these really fascinating fossils. You're really limited. So these career data sets are something that we see as a real kind of restriction for that data sharing, because how the tenure and promotion system, like you have to publish, and these things all end up being interconnected together. Scrutiny from peers. People don't want to publish something and then have someone come back and say, hey, you did that wrong, because sometimes peers are not always nice. And no one wants to be that person that publishes something or puts something out there that someone says, hey, that's wrong. People are unfamiliar with metadata or metadata standards, and there are no shared metadata standards. And this is a huge problem. There aren't even shared metadata standards within subfields or fields. There is no sharing. We're not big on sharing metadata standards, and this is certainly an issue that many of us are aware of. But even as librarians and RDM experts, if we are not familiar with these and are struggling to create these, how do we disseminate this to researchers and then ask them to follow a standard that doesn't exist? Potential data misuse. People don't want to put their data out there. This is something I've seen a lot with climate data, and have someone draw the incorrect conclusions from it, and then you end up with kind of people saying, well, climate change doesn't exist based on this data set, which someone else published and had a wildly different claim on. And perceived limited value of data, another kind of researcher bias one, where they look at their data set and say, no one else is going to want anything from this, but other people might find a lot of value in that. And I'm sure many of you have seen kind of the Panda data sharing RDM video. If not, it's well worth the watch. But you see someone come in and say, hey, I think this is valuable for research that I'm doing that's similar but not the same. And the original research is like, but that's not what I did. So it's this kind of limited value of data and limited idea of what the possibilities are of different types of data. And lack of funding is another big one. Publishing data and making it not restricted, or even documenting research that's going to be restricted, is so incredibly time consuming, and time is money. So we kind of, throughout the day, I think we've talked about a lot of these issues, but I really want to highlight them and put them all together. And I made this slide before today, so I think this kind of hits on that these are all really common shared issues because we're all talking about the same things in different presentations that we did individually from different fields, but it really brings together this idea of restricted data is hard to work with in a number of ways. So complex and time-consuming approvals, difficult to navigate request processes, they're all different, they're really obtuse, they might not be written down. Who do you contact? And this time it takes a lot. If you only have, maybe you're a 2-year postdoc, do you spend 1 year of that even just trying to get access to your data? How do you budget your time? And this is kind of the system that we've set up and we work within, not just within North America, but across the globe. This is just kind of the nature of academia, not saying it's great, but this is kind of our reality right now. It's resource intensive to access. Someone might make their data accessible and then only one person accesses it, but you have to find stuff still first. Maybe we've tagged things appropriately, but most of the time things are not out there in a way that's easy to find. So you can spend days, weeks, months kind of looking for data that's already out there so you can reuse it just to find out there is nothing out there and have to then go back to the drawing board with your ethics approvals and collect your data again from scratch. A lack of sufficient documentation, but more than usual. We don't see research data made available with great documentation most of the time, but especially restricted data because oftentimes it was never collected with the intention for it to be reused. It was collected with the intention to be for a very specific project. So folks will say, well, I don't need to document it because I'm going to remember this down the road. Spoiler alert, you won't, but we just don't have the documentation to support reuse. And the data itself is often poor quality. And a couple of people have mentioned this today. It's poor quality, it's old, it's dated. It has gaps in it that aren't kind of discussed at all. And the non-existent metadata limits discovery, but sometimes it's also non-existent data itself as well. So you find this really great data set, and then you find that it's got gaps all over the place that are for what reason, you will probably never know because it's not documented. And one of the big issues that we discussed today, but have been discussing, I think, as a broader data community as well, is this lack of infrastructure for data sharing, especially for restricted data or sensitive data, but just data in general. If you need to send 5 gigabytes of data to someone at another institution, how do you do that? Or as we see schools limit their OneDrive and Microsoft and Google storages where you could add people on, where do you put your sensitive data so it's secure? If I need to send more than 25 gigabytes of data to someone, that is my entire Microsoft OneDrive allotment. Where do I put that data? And is it on a platform that I can share from? Maybe. But what do you do? There's a lot of questions here and a lot of things for people to work through as they develop their data management plans and do RDM. There's a lot of unknowns, and we're in kind of this changing environment now where there isn't a standard to do. And how do you help people work through their various data management things if it's a single one-on-one consult every single time? There's no kind of blanket answer to these things. And again, you can't use what you don't know is there. I have no idea if something is there, so how do I even know to look for it? And it's in so many different places. How do you search all of those things at once? And we do have some solutions like Lunaris, which are federated searches, but how do we, if you only look at Lunaris, if it's not in Lunaris, where else do you look? But is restricted data really limited to health context? And I think this is where we often think about restricted data, but it really appears across different disciplines. And a lot of these kind of unique challenges I've mentioned are not limited to health context. They're not limited to science contexts or anywhere else. These are issues that every discipline experiences, whether it experiences all of the issues or just some of them, and they experience them at different kind of weights, if you will. What is really hard in a health context may be less hard in biology, but maybe there are things in biology that are more difficult than in health. So they often have different reasons for restricting data. With health, we see a lot of kind of privacy issues here. So privacy, ethics, reuse, re-identification, we see that in health a lot where people have said, well, there's a risk for re-identification, so we're not sharing any of our data. Okay, fine. But with biology, maybe it's because this is a sacred frog breeding ground and you don't want other people to come and take all the frogs. So you just don't publish any data about where those frogs live. You probably will never see that in a health context. And interdisciplinary research adds additional interdisciplinary challenges because now all of a sudden you're dealing with not challenges of just one discipline, but multiple. And when they build onto each other, you kind of get these confounding issues that make it even more difficult. And again, just easier to say data available upon request, but probably not. And a lot of research in disciplines is extractive. And I think thinking back to Dr. Franks' presentation of what is Indigenous data, a lot of things are Indigenous data. And research has a history of being very extractive, especially in Canada. And to kind of mend these things and make reparations for researchers past, oftentimes there are data sharing restrictions, or governments will say, we will share none of our data now because we are now deeply protective of our research data because in the past we've had no control over it. So now we're going to fully control it. And these add a lot of other issues that maybe we don't see as much in the Western context, but if you're doing research anywhere outside of North America, you probably, or Europe as well, you probably see a little bit more, especially places with a colonial history. And these traditionally extractive disciplines, especially anthropology and archaeology, have these additional considerations because there is a long history of colonialism and white researchers coming in and just taking whatever research, calling it theirs, taking things out of the country and calling it theirs, publishing on it, sharing it, and asking zero permissions whatsoever. And this isn't unlike research that we've done in Canada with First Nations and Indigenous peoples in Canada, but it's not just a North American issue. And these traditionally extractive research disciplines, we see this as it can add a lot, and researchers are often hesitant to share data because of this history as well. So looking at a case study, sharing fossil data is really unique, and it's very different than sharing health data, but shares a lot of kind of similar issues and issues that we've talked about today throughout all of the different panels, but in a very different context. So fossils are unique. They are quite literally one of a kind. You will not go and dig up the same fossil again. And they're also incredibly rare, but they're often considered cultural heritage. And this is really unique because they're subject to modern geopolitical borders and modern geopolitical politics, which is fascinating when you think of what is the history of fossils. And my background is in human evolution, so looking at things that are hundreds of thousands, millions of years old. They are shared history and to many of us as a species. And when we think about this, it's everyone's history. So how do you own history and who do these belong to? But again, they were dug up in modern day Kenya, Indonesia, Ethiopia, South Africa, what have you. So they're subject to those borders because this is the game of chess that the world has chosen to play. They're also extremely fragile to work with. You can't just ship a fossil across international borders, across the ocean by itself. Someone must transport it there, and very safely at that. And there are some fossils that will never leave their country of origin. Some of them do occasionally go to space. We've seen recently, if anyone saw that in the news last summer, but ideally they stay in our current atmosphere and not far from home because they're fragile. And things do happen. There are lots of examples of fossils breaking and then people gluing them together with what have you. And this makes it harder to do research on them because now you have things that are glued together and not in their original form. Hard to do secondary research on if you don't know how things were glued together because, again, we didn't document that. You can just see that it's glued. And this is where we see researchers building their careers on really small data sets. So either a single site or a single fossil or a set of fossils. And this is where people are very protective of their data because you're never going to find another site to base your entire career on like many PIs do because they're 1 in a million. They're really hard to find, and it's getting increasingly hard to get these permits as the world shifts and as modern geopolitics change and people are being more cautious about kind of environmental damage and digging and what are the costs of these and what are the environmental implications. But there's also these sociocultural challenges to restricted data. And we see this a lot with this international research of things that have kind of this colonial history and are extractive and also well known for being extractive. There was no shortage of memes about the British Museum and what the British Museum has in it. I saw a number of things with the heist at the Louvre of, have they checked the British Museum for these things? There is no shortage. It's a well-known thing that the British Museum is filled with things that are from other places, and supposedly their count for repatriation requests is some 90,000. I was chatting with a couple colleagues yesterday, and that's a lot of requests. Research is often done by Western researchers, and it excludes local communities and local researchers, many of which hold a lot of knowledge about the area, and people will come in and just say, I'm going to do this research, and we know better than you. And a good example is this is a paper that was published in 2004 from a site that my own research is from, which had a lot of issues in the geochronology, so the understanding of the order of events and things happened, and then 15 years later, they're like, oops, we made a mistake, and here is the actual thing, but there's 15 years of papers published on this incorrect understanding of the events of this site, and the local community knew the whole time. They recognized that the local researchers knew, but Western researchers will come in and say, we know better because we have this Western training. And this is where we see issues as well, where people say, when they get kind of control over research in the data, is that we're no longer going to share it because at one time we did share it and then we got walked all over. Not walked, but stomped. And artifacts and fossils often have left their country of origin. So if you go to the British Museum, the National Museum of History in the States, or anywhere, there's a lot of fossils there. They did not come from that area. So they just leave those countries, and the countries will never get them back. Or sometimes they do. Not often. Physical challenges is that fossils don't travel well, if at all, and this kind of makes it restricted. So when we think of, we've talked about restricted access in that it's restricted by privacy, but when we think of restricted access, it kind of often means access just isn't immediately available for any number of reasons. So the footprints on the screen, you can't transport the footprints. They are in the actual ground. Protecting them is a challenge, but this data and any data associated with it is restricted because you have to go to the footprints. They don't travel at all. It's extremely expensive to transport fossils, to get research and import permits. Importing things to other countries is difficult, but also the kind of bureaucratic trail of where do things go when they get to another country, who stores them, are they an institution, how do you get them out of that institution after? It's a lot of paperwork and a lot of red tape. But it's also extremely expensive to travel to fossils, to get those research permits, if they give them to you at all. And then you have to travel with your very expensive equipment. So imagine flying to South Africa with your $50,000 3D scanner. And what happens if something, what do you do if something happens to that? Never mind the fact that it can be difficult to travel to these countries. They often require additional considerations to make them safe to travel to. But what do you do with all of this? And questions of ownership. So if they're found within a modern day Kenya, but probably not found from someone who's in Kenya, it is not finders keepers. You can't just dig up a fossil and take it with you. It is not yours. But they represent human lineage in history as a whole. So who owns history? And can you own something that old? I don't have answers for these questions. They're not questions that have answers, but things that I think about a lot when I'm trying to access or working with restricted data. And what about scans of fossil replicas? Who owns those? And what is the difference between ownership of something versus authorship and credit? A good example of a really famous fossil, and a bunch of others are being returned to Indonesia after they think they were found originally in the late 1800s. So 150 some odd years later, we're now returning something. But again, who owns prehistory? When does ownership of something start? And these questions often lead to restrictions because instead of kind of grappling with these, it's easier to say it's just not available. So these things are really complex to navigate. So all of the issues we kind of talked about today with privacy issues, going across borders, data being really old or poor, no documentation, take all of these issues, and then we have working with fossil data. So the complications they pile on top of one another, and eventually it's just easier to say that this data is restricted, because how do you have the time or money to navigate all of these things? And there's no single solution. It changes. It's different all of the time. The policies change, countries change their research permitting. How do you do this? And this is the same with access requests for things like health data. These access requests change, consent changes. So you end up with data is available upon request. Maybe. And we also need these shifts in research culture. So shifts have been happening where people are making sure that communities have access, control, ownership of their own data. And this is really important to the work that we do, but may further limit data that's being shared depending on the context. And another important consideration, kind of tying all these things together, is data sovereignty. Whose data are they, and who should they be, is the better question. Museum and institutional data agreements, which is a complex kind of issue to get into, but one that definitely plagues a lot of issues where you're going to a museum to do any sort of research. Ambiguous authorship and ownership of data, especially for things that aren't directly human data. Whose data are they? And the colonial history of data collection, which is often kind of subpar at best. And then we see people who are trying and sort of succeeding. So this is a metadata record from one of the repositories that contains fossil data and various other biological data. We're missing a creator, event date, software description. The data is in copyright, and 3D printing is limited, and commercial use is not available, but there's no license. So I don't know what is or isn't possible. There's restricted data or restricted download, but there's no publisher. So people are trying really hard, but researchers often don't have the knowledge or the know-how or the time to fill out these really complex metadata records for things that would really enable this reusability. And without some of this information, this isn't the full record. The data isn't as useful as it could be. So then you have to reach out to people. But without this kind of metadata, and this one is actually more filled than most of the ones you'll see on this platform. Without this information, the data is not useful. And then we've spent time and money sharing data that can't be reused. And actually, how do we work with restricted data? So when Grant said training, this is kind of training, but also training to think more broadly about restricted data and what are some of the issues that we have. And maybe it's not just data management, but what does our data management go towards solving? So I will turn it over to Alyssa to talk a little bit more of some of the ideas we've talked about already, but they are important.
Perfect. Thank you, Anneliese. I'll take the clicker too. Thanks. So the first part of this section, we wanted to introduce the research data lifecycle. And so you're probably familiar with this, but it really is a key concept in RDM. And it basically outlines the different stages that research data go through before, during, and after a research project. And so I'll kind of give a quick overview of those different stages and some of the data management activities that they entail. So starting with planning, at this stage, we're thinking about our DMPs, our data management plans. We're maybe considering, what resources we might need for our research project. We're looking at maybe existing sources or templates, and maybe thinking about the different policies that we'll have to comply with through the course of the research project. And then moving on to collection. And so this really involves all the methods that we use to acquire and collect our data. And at this point, we're starting to generate metadata, so data about our data. We're really wanting to make sure that we're starting to document our data at this point too, and organize it, as well as keep track of making sure that the quality of the data is also good at this point. And then moving on to processing, this is really preparing the data for use. And so that might look like entering it into whatever software you might be using or platforms. This could be transcribing your data, digitizing it, anonymizing it, that sort of thing. And then the use is typically analysis. And so at this point, we're deriving information from our data, we're interpreting our data. At the preservation stage, we're looking at archive or, long-term storage uses, but this is really to extend the lifetime of our data past the research lifetime. And so considering those things as well. And ultimately, ideally, we're trying to find ways to make the data shareable. So releasing the data in some capacity if we can. And then ideally that's for reuse, and then the cycle would continue. And so the main goals and kind of what Anneliese was saying earlier, the gold standard for good RDM is really to create fair data. So data that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so we talked a lot, I think, over the course of the day about the FAIR principles. For those who don't know, they're guiding principles that were first published in 2016 in an article in Scientific Data. And so they guide a lot of the work we do, but they're also very relevant as we see the volume, the speed, and the complexity of data creation today. And so just a little bit more information on what the FAIR principles are and what they exactly mean. So starting with findable, this means that humans and computers should be able to easily find metadata and data, meaning that the metadata and data should be discoverable by both humans and machines. And then accessible. So once the user finds the data, they need to know how to access them and may require details around authentication and authorization. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that the data have to be open, but we do want to make sure that at least the metadata are available and accessible always so that people can, go from there at the very least. And then interoperable. So data usually need to be integrated with other data and need to interoperate with applications or workflows for analysis, storage, and processing. And so the goal of this is we really want different researchers from different locations and institutions to be able to use the data. And then finally, reusable. So metadata and data should be well described so that they can be replicated and are combined in different settings. And so with this principle, we're also considering what, appropriate license to attach to the data and ultimately just make wide reuse possible. And I'll pass it back to Anneliese.
Awesome. Thank you. I will try and make the rest of this quick so folks can get out of here as well. But thinking about who is the data fair for? We think about creating fair data for everyone around you. It should be findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable for people who want to reuse your data. But if you can't find or access your own data, you can't make it fair for others. And this is a really big problem we see where people go into their files and I don't know what this name is. I don't know where I put this or what order I put it in, and documenting those things can make the world of difference. So really prioritizing, making sure you can find, access, open, and reuse your own data so you don't become one of the people who can't find or can't reproduce their own data. And this will go a long way to making it reusable in the future. And we see this in a lot of we see these kind of findability and accessibility issues in what I've developed this year is to the file name Hall of Shame. So many of these are my own examples from pre-RDM days. I swear this is not what my file names look like anymore. And some of them I do have documented, but they're things that are available to a lot of people and they don't know what those things mean. And what is an important paper? And is there a difference between Komodo dragons with or without a hyphen? Maybe. And updated working thesis. Which one is updated? The two updated are from the same date. I don't know which is more recent. How do you know what to do with these types of things? And these are the issues we see that are really easy to fix, sort of. Easier to fix issues in data management at a much smaller scale. So a lot of what we've talked about already are these kind of big picture issues in data management, data sharing, and restricted data. But how do we make our data reusable if I don't know what plots for Monday are or what was special about June 20th of 2021 or what have you? You can't make your data reusable if it's not fair to yourself. Oops. And finding the unfindable. We've talked kind of, if it's fair for yourself, great, but is it still fair for other people? So I know that there are things for Homo floresiensis in this repository that we use, but it's not publicly accessible, so no one can find it to access it. And there are a lot of reasons why that is, but this is a good example of you know something's there, but I've searched for it and I can't find it. So now what? And you kind of end up just kind of wasting time looking for something that you may very well know is there, but how do you can't even request access to something if it doesn't show it's there. So like Alyssa mentioned, making the metadata accessible at a very minimum can be invaluable to people knowing what's even out there. So I kind of called it verifying as you go. So creating documentation, and lots of it, create more documentation than you think you need. You will always need more. Saving files to interoperable formats. I have seen many a file where it's in who knows what format, but I certainly can't open it anymore. Or try opening up a Windows or a Word 1998 file in 2024, 2025 Microsoft Word. It's a lot easier if it's saved in kind of an interoperable format as you go. Avoiding acronyms or documenting those that you use. People's research is filled with acronyms that they kind of just make up on the fly and say to themselves, I am going to remember what this means. I promise you, you're probably not going to remember what it means in a couple years down the road. Maybe a couple months is fine, but if you take any length of time between looking at that, you might not remember. Avoiding missing values, or at the very least, documenting why they're missing. And this is really important for reuse, because if someone doesn't know why something is missing, did you delete it? Is it an accident? Was it an outlier? So just being transparent in why something is missing. There's very valid reasons why something might be a missing value, and that's okay, but less okay if you don't document why. And keeping track of your ethical, legal, and commercial restrictions somewhere and what data they apply to. So you can track through time how things have changed. If you go back to make data reusable at a later date, what are the restrictions you had on that data, and have you documented it somewhere so you know for yourself, can I even make this reusable or put it out there? And consider any consent required for data sharing really early. It's very difficult to reconsent people, especially when we think about health data, survey data, anything. It's difficult to do that reconsent process. It will very rarely happen. REBs require it inconsistently across the board. So think about this early, and then you'll avoid that issue altogether. So kind of key tips for things that you can do that are a little bit smaller to implement and can help you feel like you're doing something, even if it seems small. We can't solve the world's problems. These are really much bigger issues that go towards creating restricted data, and maybe the next generation of researchers will be the ones who help create that positive change. But in the meantime, creating a folder structure, documenting, naming your files well is the really important part here, not just naming them or adding a number to the end of download 1, download 2, naming them well. Versioning your files numerically, either, ideally. Cleaning up unsorted files regularly. I am notorious for having a desktop filled with documents that I've downloaded over a week or a couple weeks, and I know where they are. I know what's on my desktop, but if anyone else were to go look at that, it just looks like a desktop full of documents. And I say this knowing that as a data management professional, I should be able to do this, but these are hard things to implement all the time. They do take time, and no one is perfect. So even myself as kind of a data management librarian, I do sometimes end up with a desktop filled with miscellaneous documents that I will try and set myself timelines for. By the end of this date, I am going to sort these away and not half-ass sort them into a folder that says to be sorted, so they're off my desktop, but meaningfully rename and sort so I know what's on my desktop, because some of it I don't have to keep. Some of it is like, oh, that was really important. I was supposed to read that, but it's got an 18-character name, and none of those characters mean anything to me. And document everything, and document it well. Write it down, and you will at least have a record of it, even if you forget. Data management planning, there's a lot of resources about this online, so I won't go into depth about this, but creating a data management plan and thinking about your research holistically. So not just what am I going to need throughout the research process, but what's going to happen to the research after I'm done the active research phase. So thinking about the full process and not just the immediate future. And this planning is going to help you anticipate any challenges before they happen. It might help you avoid them, but at least it can help you be prepared for them. And again, think about consent and data sharing early. Oops, wrong way again. some more details about creating a DMP, and I'm happy to make these slides available as well after folks want them, but creating something that's as detailed as possible and needed. And this is often more detailed than a funder mandated one. So creating a document for yourself or your lab or your research group that has all those details and will be helpful for onboarding and offboarding students as well. Have project specific details, so really detailed is more better, and file naming conventions. So when people come into your project, they can look and say, hey, I know what that is, or they will know what's in Annelise's files as well, and not just Anneliese. File versioning details, no updated. So are you starting things at version number 0 or version number 1? What does this mean? I've recently been confused about this on a project of, is version 0 the first one? Is it the most recent one? What does this mean? And really consider the full lifespan of a project. So before the project starts to after it finishes. Data just doesn't disappear when you've published your paper. It still exists. So let's think about data past the end of a research project and past publication. And we call this a data management training of sorts. So what is research data management? Well, we've been kind of talking about it this whole time and how it can support things. So the active organization, maintenance, and archiving of research, and really all of these processes that we do during research, whether we do them well or maybe not as well as we could, but it encompasses all these things. But what's really clear here is it's not just data sharing. It is also data sharing, but not just data sharing. And I'm pretty sure everyone here, I'm just talking to the converted here about the benefits of RDM. So for time's sake, I will just kind of gloss over the top ones. Workflow efficiency, academic reputation we kind of talked about, and your contributions to the research community. But where do we go from here? What does this look like? And I had originally anticipated that there would be hopefully some discussion at the end here. So if people have questions or ideas, I know folks are probably eager to get out of here, but where do we go from here? Is there a single kind of guideline or documentation that we can create? Maybe, but what are other kind of folks thinking of? What do we do with all of this? We now know all this information from not just this presentation, but the rest of the day. What do we do with this now that we've kind of had this conversation as a community, not just here, but kind of global community? What do we do with this? I don't have the answers. There are no answers to this, but it's certainly a question to kind of think about as we move forward. So I can answer any questions, but if there's no questions, I'm also happy to be done.